Hello and welcome back to our TM Soup to Nuts video series. Today's episode, episode 4, is the episode where we tackle the engine room, the orchestration part of this process, which is the transportation planning per se. So we'll get into the transportation planning cockpit, we'll pick up where we left off last time, trying to plan those freight units that were the product of our sales orders and plan them to freight orders. We'll see how the HANA Spatial Integration scope item works in conjunction with transportation management to calculate distances and accurate scheduling of our freight orders. We'll also be showing you some of the pitfalls. We'll be showing you some of the ways that are available to you to plan your freight units to your freight orders, how much automation you want to let the system have, and how much of a handle you want to be able to have on that particular process. To illustrate the planning that we will be carrying out today, we've created a certain number of sales orders that have yielded freight units that are going to be delivered to our customers, all based in California. So the network that we will use to illustrate the planning capabilities is fairly simple. It's made up of one shipping point, our main distribution center, which is in the south of the Bay Area to the south of San Francisco in Palo Alto, and we are from there shipping products to some of our customers that are geographically located to the north of San Francisco. So we'll see how the system reacts when we try to plan those different cargo items going to those different locations that are at opposites of each other, and we'll also then see how much of an influence you can have on that particular planning process. So without further ado, let's just jump right into the system and get onto it. So the transportation cockpit is accessed via an app that is aptly named Transportation Cockpit. And the first time you launch it, you will be presented with a number of selection criteria that allow you to have an influence on the data that will be presented to you subsequently when you really get into the transportation cockpit. The selection criteria can have an influence on the freight units that will be presented to you. So that is essentially the cargo that you want to plan to freight orders, or you can also load freight units that have already been planned, depending on the selection criteria. There is also the vehicle types, which essentially is going to influence the resources that are available to you in the transportation planning cockpit. And then you also have freight orders, which, as the name indicates, would have an impact or influence on the freight orders that are presented to you in the cockpit. Now, the freight orders might be an odd one, but imagine that your workflow is going to span across the day. Meaning that you could, for example, be planning freight units in the morning, save your freight orders as they are, come back to them a bit later on in the day, keep loading some more freight units onto those freight orders until the full capacity of the freight orders is consumed, then close the freight orders, send them off to the carriers for execution. So once you've selected or indicated your selection criteria, also note that you can have different selection criteria that can also be tailored to your workflow. By that I mean that you could, for example, be planning in one instant your intrastate transportations and then subsequently come back again in the cockpit to plan your interstate transportations. The point here is that you can limit the amount of data that is going to be presented to you in the cockpit so that it is more manageable, i.e. you're not overwhelmed with thousands of freight units. You can really tailor the amount of data to your particular workflow. Once you've put in your selection criteria, you can obviously save them because it can be quite tedious depending on the amount of selection criteria. But once you are comfortable with what you have done, you simply click on continue, and that will really load you into the transportation cockpit per se. Once in the transportation cockpit, you can directly see those selection criteria, how they reflect what you see in the transportation cockpit. So the transportation cockpit is divided into 4 quadrants. In the top left, we have the freight units, which is the result of those freight unit selection criteria. In the bottom left quadrant, we have the trucks, the resources that are available to me in this particular planning session. But note also that if I, for example, forgot or omitted to add a resource in my selection screen, you can use the button Insert Truck Type to add that particular missing resource. You don't need to get out of the cockpit and come back into it. In the top right quadrant, we see the road freight orders, and at the moment it's empty, but as I do my planning, we will see these road freight orders quadrant being populated with the result of my plannings. And then we have in the bottom right quadrant, a quadrant named Road Freight Order Hierarchy, which is going to become very handy when we want to understand the contents of a road freight order in this quadrant. Because in this particular quadrant, we will have one line per freight order. So it becomes difficult to understand exactly what that road freight order is made up of in terms of freight units, in terms of intermediate stops. So that road freight order can be exploded, the contents can be made visible into this road freight order hierarchy pane down here at the bottom. Before we delve into each of these quadrants, a couple of things that are of importance. We have the refresh button. Now the refresh button is, if you click it, it's essentially going to reset the planning situation. So everything that you have done until the last time you saved what you had done in planning, once you click the refresh button, all of that is just going to be removed from the transportation cockpit as if you had never done it. So the refresh button brings you back to the previously saved situation. You also have this button here, change selection criteria, which is really handy. You'll probably find out at first when you start using the transportation cockpit that you'll have a tendency to click this little arrow to get out of the transportation cockpit completely. But that's not really the most efficient way to go about refining the data that you see in the transportation cockpit. So instead of going completely out of the transportation cockpit by clicking this little arrow here, you can click on change selection criteria, which is going to bring you back to that same selection screen, but allow you to further refine the data that is presented to you. As an example, it could be that we'd gone into the transportation cockpit and I saw that there was an overwhelming amount of information being presented to me, and what I wanted to do was kind of break it down into a more manageable chunk. What I could do here is add an additional plural selection criteria to further refine what I am seeing. Once you've done that, you simply click continue, which takes you right back into the transportation cockpit, taking those amended selection criteria into consideration. Okay. What we also see is that each quadrant is somewhat limited in terms of real estate. So obviously the bigger screen you have, the better it's going to be, but you also have the possibility of maximizing the real estate that is taken by each one of these quadrants. So as you can see, each of these quadrants has this little icon, which allows you to maximize the information presented to you, which of course adds great readability benefits. So now we're looking at the freight unit stages quadrant that has been maximized, and we immediately see different color coding that obviously has a meaning. We can see that some columns have a piece of information indicated when the others do not. And essentially what we're looking at here, what we're seeing is a number of freight units. We can see a mixture of freight units that are not planned. So they're just the result of my sales orders or purchase orders. So these are just order-based transportation requirements that are needing to be planned. And here we have these freight units that have this little check mark, meaning that they have been planned. But on top, in addition to that, they also have this color coding. And this color coding is a personal choice, it's a personal taste, it's a personal decision. Not everybody needs to have that. What you can also do in this particular screen here is obviously by clicking on this little gear icon, you can arrange the data that is presented to you. You can decide the columns, the order in which they are presented, the width that they will occupy. You can also add some sorting and grouping. You can add some filtering. You can add some aggregation. You can also add some conditional formatting. And the conditional formatting is exactly what I've applied here. So I've said that if that freight unit is planned or has the status planned, then I want the color to be green, meaning so it's immediately and clearly a visual cue to me beyond that little check mark that the freight unit being presented there has been planned. In terms of other information that we see here that is directly interesting is here we can see the distance information as well as the net duration. Now this is interesting because it shows that the HANA Spatial Integration has already kicked in. So in the transportation cockpit, we went into it, and for the pair of source and destination location, let me open this up a little bit, even though it's not going to be super meaningful, but it's just a number representing a location. So for this pair of locations, TM communicated with the HANA Spatial Service that is on the business technology platform and asked for those two geopoints to return it a distance. So we can see that to go from my shipping point down in Palo Alto to this particular location here, the distance is 153 odd kilometers, and the net duration to travel between these 2 points would be 2 hours and 14. Now obviously this is going to change as we amend the routing, we amend the planning of those freight units. Another great feature that you have available to you is the ability to maintain multiple page layouts, again to suit your particular workflow. So as soon as I came into the transportation cockpit, I just wanted to see all my freight units with a particular page layout that I've decided. Now I'm going to delve into the details of that information, and now I just want to see the freight units that need to be planned. So as you can see, the freight units that had that planned and that color coding of green have been now omitted from my screen, and I can just solely focus on the information at hand, on the information that I need to plan. But again, we have a variety of information here. We can see that we are going to different locations. We can see that we have different dates. So again, you can have another page layout that will present the data to you in a different manner yet again. So now I'm going to sort this by date to get a better picture, and right away, wow, I can see that this is quite clearer. So I can see that I have 4 freight units that are needing to be delivered by the 2nd of the 9th. I've got 7 requiring delivery by the 3rd of the 9th, and then I've got some other freight units that lie a little bit further down the track in the future. I also have requested an aggregation based on my sort criteria. So I also here have a bird's eye view of the total weight that represents these 4 freight units, as well as the volume, the cubic meters that they will occupy, which again is providing me some initial cues, initial indication in terms of what kind of resources am I going to need to leverage to transport this. Is it going to be a 40-ton truck? Is it going to be more like a van? So again, you have this information in the back of your mind that you can start to think about how you're going to be planning all of this. Another piece of information that we see here that is really important is that we can see that some of these freight units have these times indicated here. So we can see that this freight unit is ideally to be delivered on the 3rd of the 9th at 7 a.m. But we have another freight unit here that is also ideally delivered on the 3rd of the 9th, but this one is at 7:15 a.m. And you might be wondering, well, why do we have these different times? I mean, we haven't done any planning yet. This is the raw freight unit that came out of the sales order. And this information relates to the goods receiving times that your customers have provided to you. Because obviously you want a scheduling to be done taking into account when your customer premises are actually going to be open. Now you don't have to maintain this information, but just know that if you do not maintain it, then TM will use the next best piece of information, which is to say, I need to deliver on the 3rd of the 9th. I don't know exactly when your customer is open, so I'm going to schedule the requirement at the beginning of the day, which is going to be midnight. Now, of course, depending on your customer operation times, this might be unrealistic to try and plan for a truck to arrive at your customer location at midnight if he's only going to be opening at 7:15 to start receiving goods. This information, as I said, is maintained in the customer master. So let's quickly open up a new pane and see where we store this information in the customer master. So we can view that information in the Manage Business Partner Master Data app. And then for one of the business partners that we are using, we'll go into the customer record. We then go down to the Roles tab, then further drill down into the customer role. And then in this role, we have this tab called Unloading Points, which will allow us to create the various unloading points that might exist at this customer location. And then for each of the unloading points, we can then maintain the hours of operation. And we can see that this particular customer has goods receiving hours from Monday through to Friday from 7 a.m. to 11 a.m. They have a short lunch break, then go from 11:50 through to 4 p.m. in the afternoon. So we're back in the transportation cockpit, and then you might say, well, that's great. I see that I can maintain the hours of operation for goods receivings at my customer location, but that's in the customer master. So how did that go from the customer master to my freight unit? Well, for that, we need to look at the sales order. So if we, for that same customer that we just look at the sales order 22515, and then if we pick one of the items, so we'll pick the first one, then we go to the scheduling lines, and for the first schedule line, go to shipping. We can see that the delivery date does not just maintain the time of midnight, but it actually has picked up the goods receiving time as it was defined at the customer business partner master. And if we go to the shipping tab, you can also see here that we have the information pertaining to the unloading point. So if your customer had multiple unloading points with different goods receiving hours, you could of course in the sales order pick the correct unloading point so that the correct time would then be reflected in the freight unit as well. Okay, so that explains how the delivery date and time has trickled through from the customer business partner master data through to the freight unit. Now, if you wanted to make this even more realistic, and by that I mean that if your shipping point also had hours of operations that weren't 24/7, you could also maintain the hours of operation of that shipping point, except that for that you would need to maintain that information in the SSDOIs relevant to the shipping points. If you don't, then it will just assume that the shipping point also operates 24/7. All right, so that kind of gives us an idea in terms of the quadrants that are available in the transportation cockpit, what information they present, the tools that are available to you to tailor the data presented to a manner that suits your workflow. So let's just jump right into looking at the first possibility that I'm going to present to allow you to plan those freight units. So the first method that I'm going to show you is what I call the load and go or fire and forget planning method, which is to essentially pick a whole bunch of freight units, pick a resource, throw them at the system and let him plan how the planning is going to unfold. So I'm going to pick all of these 7 freight units that are planned for the 3rd of the 9th. And if you obviously had more than just one freight unit, you don't want to be clicking each line one after the other one. Imagine if you had 100 to do. So what you can do is you simply click on the first line, you select the first line, and then you shift click on the last line corresponding to the last line of your selection. So this essentially now summarizes those freight units that I want to plan. I can also, if I look at the aggregate, I can see that the total weight of those freight units is 1.6 odd tons, and it's going to be 16.4 cubic meters. So I'm going to pick my smallest resource, which is this one here, which has a max capacity of 2.8 tons and a volume of 35 cubic meters, which is well within those freight units that I need to plan. So I'm going to pick my resource. As I said, I'm just going to throw them at the system and let him plan it. So I've picked my freight units, I pick my resource, and I say assign selected items. So TM is going to have a bit of a think about it. It's going to be communicating with the HANA Spatial Services. And once it's done that, it's going to come back and create a freight order. So firstly, the indication here at the bottom telling me that everything is green. So 7 freight units have been assigned. They've been planned to a freight order $1. $1 meaning that it's a temporary number. And until I click save, that freight order is not saved. It's not committed to the database. So we can see that we have one freight order that has been created. We can maximize this pane to get a bit more information. So we can see that in terms of capacity, we are using 59% of the available capacity of that resource. So we still have a bit of room to put a few more items of cargo in there, but that's not too bad for a start. So first thing to note that we have some basic capacity monitoring capabilities in TM. The next thing, of course, is the status, and it's showing me an all green. Green is always good, meaning that there is no conflict in times, there is no contradiction in the planning. So from a planning and execution point of view, this freight order, as it is now, is looking good. I can also see that associated with that consumed capacity, information pertaining to what is still remaining. So I could potentially continue to fill up this freight order up to include additional cargo up to the weight that is indicated there. So I can load another ton roughly of cargo, or 18 cubic meters. Other pieces of information that are quite interesting is that I again have had that HANA Spatial Service Integration that kicked in, and TM is telling me that this freight order from start to finish is going to travel a distance of 272 kilometers as planned via the HANA Spatial Services Integration. Then we also have information pertaining to time, and here it's telling me that the gross duration of this freight order, so from start to finish, is 6 hours and 35 minutes and a few seconds, but the net duration is 4 hours and 5 minutes and 50 seconds. And the difference between the gross duration and the net duration is that the gross duration includes loading and unloading time. So the loading time at my shipping point, as well as the unloading time that I will incur when I hit each one of my customer locations. And then, of course, lastly, I can also see the truck, which is the one that I had assigned. This is also a field that is that has a search help behind it, which means that if for some reason I am overutilizing the available capacity of that truck, I can simply change it for a bigger one. So before we move back onto the transportation cockpit, I just also want to quickly explain where the information regarding the loading and unloading time is coming from. And for that, we need to go and look at another app, which is called Manage Planning Profiles. So this is a dedicated app which named Manage Planning Profiles, and in the standard delivery, you only have one planning profile to work with, but you can customize the settings in it to suit your particular processes. So the planning profile delivered by default is called S1, and this profile is going to include data pertaining to the planning settings as well as the scheduling settings. So let's look at the planning settings first. The planning settings that are recorded in the planning profile pertain to the planning horizon, which is expressed in days, and the planning horizon is essentially that period of time in which you allow yourself to plan freight units onto freight orders. In this case, it indicated as 7. You could also maintain an additional duration to go beyond the 7 days if you wanted to say, for example, 7 days and 3 hours. You can also maintain an offset. The offset, I would say, is important if you want to block the first few days from now, from the present into the future, meaning that you don't want to perform or be able to upset or change the immediate planning for the next 2 days, for example. So you could put in an offset of 2 days, meaning I don't want to plan what has already been planned in the next 2 days. I want to start my planning from day 3 onwards for 7 days. Then you also have, in terms of other settings, which are kind of hard-coded, I would say at this point, is the resulting freight order. So when you plan freight units on to freight orders, the resulting freight order type will be of type SFO2, which is the internal freight order type. And internal meaning the planning is done in TM and not in an external system. Then we have the scheduling settings, and this is where that 30-minute loading unloading time came from. So you can see that you can maintain a nominal time for both the outbound and inbound loading unloading times, and by default the nominal time of 30 minutes has been added to the standard content. You can of course tailor that, because you might want to say that to load a 40-ton truck, it's logically going to take me more time to do so than it is to load a van, for example. Similarly, you might also want to change the loading and unloading times based on the locations that you'll be going to, because it could be that some sites are understaffed, so it's going to take a bit longer to load or unload a truck. It could also be that some sites require for some particular induction, some particular paperwork to be done, which again is going to increase the loading and unloading time. And similarly, you could also have sites that are super efficient, where the loading or unloading time will be reduced to maybe 15 minutes. So again, you have the ability to really tailor those settings to your particular situation so that it has a really positive impact on the overall scheduling of your freight orders. Then what you can also do quickly before we get out of the planning profile is, if you're unsure of your settings, what you've indicated here, you can do a simulation of the planning horizon. So you would simply say, okay, I'm going to simulate the planning horizon, and if my current hypothetical date and time is X and Y, what would my planning horizon look like? i.e., when would it finish? So you can see here that you have that simulation telling you that for the time of the 30th of August, midnight, the end of your planning horizon will take you to the 5th of the 9th at just before midnight. Okay, so that's the planning horizon, and hopefully explains why we are getting differences between the gross duration and the net duration. So again, gross duration includes loading, unloading time. Net duration is really my time on the road. Let's close up this quadrant. As I said earlier on, this quadrant here just shows us one line, and it could be interesting to sometimes understand, well, what is the detail of that freight order? What have I already loaded onto it? What does that look like? And if you want to do this, this is where the road freight order hierarchy quadrant is going to come in super handy. So I pick the freight order that I want to look at. I click on this actions icon here, and that's going to load my freight order in the hierarchy down here at the bottom. Now again, we can adjust the size of these quadrants to get a bit more information, but even if that is insufficient, as before, we can simply click the maximize icon to really take up the entire screen. Okay, so I'm now going to open up this particular column here so that we have a better idea of where we're going, and then we can also look at our network map to see what the resulting planning has been done, what it looks like. So I actually really like this screen because it does give us a really good bird's eye view of what is happening on this freight order. So again, at the top line, we have the high-level information pertaining to when the freight order is going to start, where it's going to start, at what time it's going to finish, and where it's going to finish. And I've got all of this information in between. So it's telling us that this journey will start at our shipping point, SP1710, and denoted by this little arrow going up, it's showing us that we are loading into the truck all of these particular freight units here. We will then travel on to the first customer location, which is in the town of Fairfield. And at this point, what we are going to do is we are going to unload. So it's coming off the truck, this particular freight unit here. And these other freight units are going to remain on the truck. Going on to Vacaville, I again have a freight unit that will remain on the truck, and 2 will be offloaded. So I'm delivering those at my customer location, and we have those arrows that nicely help us to understand if the cargo is at this particular stop going to remain on the truck, is going to get loaded onto the truck, or unloaded from the truck. We also have the thermometer-like indicator allowing us to track the capacity utilized of my particular resource. And obviously this kind of comes in handy if you wanted to plan both pickup and deliveries at the same time on the same freight order. So for argument's sake, at this point here in Vacaville, we'll have 28% capacity consumed, meaning that I can pick up some more cargo at this location and then bring it to another customer or bring it back somewhere else. We then also have the times, obviously, and what we can see is the system took the opening time of my first stop, which is for the goods receiving, which is 7:15, and it has therefore backward scheduled my freight order to say, well, you should be arriving at 6:45, which will then allow you that 30-minute to start unloading your truck, and by that time the customer location will be open for receiving the goods at 7:15, and so on until the end of the freight order, which is 10:31. Now let's see what the planning did, because if you recall, what we did was we just took those freight units and we threw them at TM and HANA Spatial Services to say, right, you try and make some sense out of this. So we can see that the freight order is leaving the shipping point 1710, which is in Palo Alto, and the first stop is Fairfield. So let's have a quick look at the map that we've got. So this is the shipping point 1710, and the first stop is Fairfield. So it went from Palo Alto to Fairfield, check, that's my first stop. Then Fairfield, it went to the next place, which is Vacaville. So Fairfield, it went on to Vacaville, perfect, check. Then it went to Sacramento, that goes up to Sacramento, and then my last stop, which is Stockton. So I don't know about you, but I think that this particular planning makes sense to me. I don't see any zigzagging. It has computed a freight order that caters to my customer requirements in terms of delivery dates and times. And as far as I can see, it's a fairly optimal run. So an optimization of that freight order has occurred. So let's just get rid of these doodles and we'll go back to the transportation cockpit. So again, I can close down this particular quadrant, and also note that you can, in the freight order hierarchy, depending on the amount of detail that you want to see, you can toggle between looking at the freight order with freight units or without freight units, meaning that without freight units you just see the locations. If you are happy with this particular planning, then what you can do is simply save your planning result, and the $1 will become a fully fledged freight order number. We're now going to refresh the screen, and if you recall, I said that if you click on refresh, it's going to take you back to the last time you saved the results of your planning, which I haven't done any planning thus far, so it's essentially taking me back to the original situation that I had when I first came into the cockpit earlier on. We're now going to move on to the second planning type that I can think of, which is what I would refer to as an interactive planning. So it's a bit more requiring effort on your side, but that might also work depending on your workflow. So again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick up my resource because I'm going to be planning those same freight units, but this time I'm going to be planning them one by one. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick the Sacramento freight unit as the first freight unit that I want to plan. Now, again, let's have a quick look at the map. Sacramento is that stop that we have right there. Okay. So I'm picking my freight unit, my resource, my chosen resource. I'm going to say assign selected item. And as before, we should have a freight order being created. There it is. Again, we have those indicators telling us that everything is great. And we look at the freight order hierarchy. This is going to be a very simple freight order in the sense that we really just have one stop. So we've got to start and we've got to finish. So I'm looking at my resource consumption, capacity consumption, which is 1%. So I can load some more stuff in there. I'm now going to pick those 3 freight units that I've got there that are going to Stockton. Again, let's have a quick look on the map. Stockton is the town that's to the right of my planning zone. So I've selected these 3 freight units, and then what you can do is you can simply drag and drop them onto the previously created freight order, and this will again append the scheduling and the contents of that freight order. So now the capacity consumption has gone up to 28%, so we can see that something's happened. The system also tells me that 3 freight units have been added. And if we now look at the planning, we can see that Stockton has been inserted as the middle point in my freight order. My freight order originally was going from shipping point to Sacramento, and the system has now inserted Stockton inside my freight order. Again, let's have a quick look at the map. Well, I think it does make sense, right? I mean, there's no point me going to Sacramento first and then coming back down to Stockton. So again, let's get rid of that doodle and come back to the planning cockpit. And I'm going to do the same thing with the last freight units that we've got there. I'm going to pick the Vacaville freight units. Again, I drag and drop them onto my freight order. The same phenomenon should happen. So capacity consumption should go up, and freight order should also then be amended. So now the freight order is going from my shipping point to Stockton, then Sacramento, then Vacaville. So Stockton was inserted before Sacramento, but Vacaville has been added after Sacramento. Again, if we look at the map, it does make sense, right? We want to go to Stockton, then go to Sacramento, then go to Vacaville. It doesn't make sense to have some zigzagging done in this planning. So again, highlighting the optimization that is happening in this scheduling run that we're doing now. And then I've got my last resource, which is the one going to Fairfield. And again, I'm just going to drag and drop that onto my freight order. It's important that you drop it on the freight order per se. Capacity has gone up. And if we now look at this particular freight order, we can see that it's going from Stockton to Sacramento to Vacaville to Fairfield. So again, Stockton, Sacramento, Vacaville, Fairfield. So again, this is a planning that does make sense to me. There's no zigzagging. So again, shows the optimization that is done. Before we go on to the next planning type, I also want to quickly show you that you always, as the human, I would say, have the upper hand. You have the power to decide if that freight order makes sense or does not make sense. So to illustrate what I'm trying to say is, let me maximize this particular quadrant. Now, it could be that the customer that I have in Fairfield is my best customer. He's the one that drives a lot of business my way, and I don't want him to be delivered last. I want him to be delivered first because they contacted me for reason XYZ. They said it was really important and urgent that they get the goods as early as possible on the day. So I'm going to, even if it means that I'll need to pay more for the transportation cost, what I'm trying to show here is that you have the ability to, as the human, decide what that freight order routing is going to look like. So I'm going to say that Fairfield should be the first stop on my freight order. So I'm going to move it from last to first. So I'm going to pick that particular stop, which is the last one, which corresponds to Fairfield. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag and drop it onto the stop that I want it to replace, which is the first one, which is Stockton. So I drop it on the Stockton, and you can see that my freight order now has been completely rejigged to account for my decision to bring Fairfield as the first stop. So my order now doesn't make a great deal of sense if you go back to the map, because I'm going from my shipping point to Fairfield. Then from Fairfield, I'm going to go to Stockton. From Stockton, I'm going to go back to Vacaville. And then from Vacaville, I'm going to go to Sacramento. No, it's even worse actually, because I'm going from Stockton to Sacramento and then back to Vacaville. So there's some zigzagging that is happening in this particular scheduling. But as I said, this reflects that you as the human remain in control, you remain in charge, you have the say of the power of decision to amend the routing of that freight order. Let's close this quadrant, and once again I'm going to refresh the cockpit. Now the next planning type that I'm going to show you is the one that I'm going to call the long way round. So in this particular planning, it's going to allow you to set up upfront what the routing of a freight order should look like, and then you'll be able to plan your freight units onto that particular freight order. So this time what I'm going to do is I'm going to start from down here at the bottom. I'm going to pick a resource and I'm going to say create a freight document. And I'm going to get a pop-up where it says, fine, what do you want to do? So I'm going to say, of course, that I start from my shipping point, which is 1710. I'm not going to stipulate a date because I will let the freight units dictate that when I drag them onto my freight order. And in terms of destination location, I'm going to pick the Sacramento location, which is 171.86098. So 00171, which is 98, which is this one. Okay, and I could also, as you can see here, create a number of identical documents, but I'm just going to create one. We're going to say okay. So I've got another freight order that just got created. For amending this freight order routing, I need to bring it down into the hierarchy. So again, I select it, I bring it down into the hierarchy. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to amend the routing of this freight order by using this capability here of insert location. So I'm going to click on insert location. I've also selected my freight order. Oh, my apologies. I'm going to select stop. And the system says, okay, fine. So where do you want to insert that location? And I've got a sequence number that the system is allowing me to select to indicate where I want that location, that new location that I'm about to insert, to be added. So the sequence numbers at the moment, I've got 1 and 2, which is essentially my shipping point, and 2, which is the address in Sacramento. I have the option to replace the first stop, which is the shipping point, with my about to be inserted location. I can also put it as the second stop, or I can add it as the last stop. I'm going to add it as the second intermediate stop. So I'm going to insert that location between my shipping point and Sacramento. And this time I'm going to pick, for example, the address from Stockton, which is 0017186. Stockton, yep, perfect, which is this one, and I'm going to say okay. So what will happen is that this is now going to become the second location, second stop of my freight order. I click OK, and we can now see that the freight order is going from shipping point, so Palo Alto, to Stockton and then Sacramento. I'll add another location still. Yep. So again, I have the ability to select the sequence number, but also note that seeing as I've added other additional locations since the time when the freight order was first created, then obviously the number of sequences is also being incremented. But I want to add again this stop as the second stop, so right after my shipping point. So I keep the sequence number 2, and this time I'm going to insert the location that corresponds to the stop in Vacaville. So it's going to be 0017186.095, and we're going to say OK. All right, so at this point I'm going to leave it there, right? So I've got this freight order that's going from the shipping point. So from shipping point, it's going to go to Vacaville, and then from Vacaville, it's going to go down to Stockton, and then from Stockton, it's going to go up to Sacramento. So again, a nice zigzag routing that probably doesn't make a great deal of sense, but it does with regards to what we're trying to illustrate here, which is that you are the master of this particular route. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick one freight unit that is going to Stockton. And again, I just drag and drop it onto my freight order, and we can see that the routing of my order has not been amended at all, but the freight unit has been correctly added to the location Stockton, and that's where it's going to get unloaded. I'm going to now pick another freight unit, which is the one going to Vacaville, and again, this should not affect the routing of my freight order, which it does not. It does keep Vacaville as the second stop. And lastly, we can add a freight unit that is meant to go to Sacramento, and also does not affect the routing of our freight order. So that's another way of doing it, the long way around, because it requires for you to first create the shell, the freight order with the ability to insert locations the way you want them to be. But anyway, so that's just another way of doing the planning. Again, let me refresh to go back to our initial situation, and I will just close this off by showing you a couple of other possibilities that we have here. The other possibilities that you have to plan the freight units onto a particular freight order is by selecting them here. I'm going to pick the 4 freight units for the second, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to say create a capacity document, create a road freight order, and what is going to happen here is that these 4 freight units are going to be clubbed together onto one freight order. So it's a little bit similar to what we have seen previously with regards to assign selected items. The only difference here is that there is no resource that has been assigned to it. Even if I had selected a resource, it would still not have been assigned to this freight order. So that's another way of planning for freight units. Another way of planning those freight units, and this is a method that could come in really handy if these freight units were going to be full truckloads or full container loads. So assuming, or let's imagine for a moment that each of these lines represents a full truckload, meaning that each one of these freight units is going to occupy the entire capacity offered by a particular resource. So rather than selecting each of these freight units and uniquely saying create document, create freight order, what you can do is you can simply select these 4 freight units, then say create multiple capacity documents, create multiple road freight orders, and this will have the effect of creating one freight order for each one of those freight units. So again, a really handy way of planning those freight units that are fully utilizing the capacity offered by the given resources that you have to plan with. And then lastly, the last thing that I really want to show you is the influence of dates in the planning. So I am again going to pick these 4 freight units that are scheduled. Actually, let's look at the capacity. So this is 1.6164. Okay, so it's still going to just use 2.8 ton truck. So I'm going to pick those 4 freight units that are scheduled for delivery on the 2nd of the 9th, and again click on Assign Selected Items. And the result that we have here is, as we can see, everything is positive. We can see that the dates of the resulting freight order is the 2nd of the 9th, and it will finish on the 2nd of the 9th, which corresponds to the dates that we had on those freight units. Now I'm going to add to that freight order, because I can see that I do have a lot of capacity available still to plan onto it. I can see that I've got some additional freight units that are scheduled to arrive not on the 2nd but on the 3rd. So I'm going to pick those freight units, and again I'm going to select all of them and drag and drop them onto that freight order that was scheduled previously to finish on the 2nd of the 9th. So those freight units have now been added on to my existing freight order, bringing the capacity utilization to a better number. But if we look at the dates of the freight order, they have now moved from the 2nd to the 3rd. So the freight order that was planned for the 2nd has now been moved on to the 3rd. And to explain why this has happened, we again need to go and look at the sales order. So let's look at a sales order. We'll use the same one as before. And if we go to the header shipping information, we selected a shipping condition that, based on the SSC UI that we saw previously, is telling the system that this is a sales order that needs to be planned via TM. And upon selecting this shipping condition, it also then made a new field called delivery date rule visible to the UI. And we can see that the option here is on requested date or later. And by default, this particular delivery date rule is that which also gets copied to the item level. So let's look at the item level. But you could, if you wanted to, also maintain it specifically or differently for a given item. And the options that you have here are essentially that the items should be delivered on the requested date or later. And that explains why my freight order was delayed from the 2nd to the 3rd, because we are still being compliant with this constraint in that we are going to deliver on the requested date or later. So we initially were going to deliver it on the requested date of the 2nd, but then we moved it to the 3rd, but we are still complying with this particular rule here. The other option that you might have would be on the confirmed date. So again, think about hard constraints, saying that we want these products to be delivered on the confirmed date. Or the last option that you have is that you would want the cargo to be delivered by the confirmed date. So again, you have different ways of influencing how the scheduling of the freight orders is going to pan out. Let's go back to the cockpit, and again, if you were happy with what you had done here, you would simply select save. And that really is it as far as the transportation cockpit planning goes. So there you go. This is transportation planning, easy peasy. So I hope that this video was instructive and it has provided you with the foundational basis to start learning, to start using the product. So the ball really is in your court now. By all means, I invite you to start testing, playing around in the cockpit, finding that groove, that workflow that works for you, for your organization, to optimize your shipments and make full use of the SAP S/4HANA Cloud transportation management capabilities. So until next time, stay safe.
My daddy's making it hurt.